I am Arthur Vance. I run a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire. I do not have time for feelings, and I definitely don't do romance. But after a wild one-night stand with a soft-hearted baker, my positive pregnancy test just ruined my 5-year growth strategy. And now, he's occupying my boardroom with warm pastries.
The 50th floor of Vance Global Holdings didn't have windows, it had architectural boundaries. From his monolithic obsidian desk, Arthur Vance could look down on the entirety of the city's financial district, reduced to a grid of scurrying ants and blinking taillights. The view was precisely how Arthur liked his world, ordered, distant, and entirely under his control. At 34, Arthur was a statistical anomaly and a corporate myth. He was an Omega who had not just survived the ruthless, alpha-dominated world of venture capitalism, he had conquered it. He did not give in to instincts, he suppressed them. He did not suffer from emotional volatility, he weaponized data. His scent, typically a faint, sharp note of silver needle tea and ozone, was permanently masked by heavy, medical-grade blockers. To the business world, Arthur Vance was an unfeeling machine wrapped in a bespoke three-piece suit. The Q3 projections are short by 0.4%, Arthur said, his voice a low, cool baritone that cut through the tension of the boardroom like a scalpel. Across the marble table, 3 senior vice presidents, all dominant alphas, visibly braced themselves. We had supply chain disruptions in the logistics sector, Mr. Vance, one managed to stammer out, adjusting his tie. I don't pay you to describe disruptions, Julian. I pay you to anticipate them, Arthur replied smoothly, not even looking up from his tablet. Fix it by Friday, or I will find a department head who doesn't require a weekend to understand basic predictive modeling. He dismissed them with a slight flick of his fingers. The executive scrambled out of the room, leaving Arthur alone in the silence. He leaned back, closing his eyes as a sudden, unfamiliar wave of exhaustion washed over him. He pinched the bridge of his nose. For the past 2 weeks, he had been feeling marginally off. A persistent, dull ache in his lower abdomen, a bizarre aversion to his morning double espresso, and a bone-deep lethargy that no amount of discipline could shake. I need to adjust my blocker dosage, he thought, rationalizing the phantom symptoms. The workload is simply catching up. His eyes drifted to the small, elegant leather planner on his desk. He flipped back exactly 6 weeks. A single date was marked with a tiny, discreet cross. 6 weeks ago, Arthur had experienced a catastrophic lapse in judgment. It had been the night after finalizing the acquisition of a rival firm, a grueling, 18-month negotiation that had pushed him to his absolute physical limits. Exhausted, his system depleted, and his strictly timed heat-suppressant routine momentarily thrown off by a time zone miscalculation, he had found himself in an upscale, quiet lounge 3 blocks from his office. He just wanted a single glass of neat scotch to quiet his racing mind. Then, he had walked in. Arthur shook his head, trying to banish the memory, but his mind traitorously filled in the details. The man had been massive, broad-shouldered, thick-chested, an unmistakable alpha presence, but his energy hadn't been aggressive or suffocating like the alphas Arthur dealt with daily. It had been warm. Safe. He smelled of rich vanilla, toasted pecans, and burnt sugar. A scent so comforting it had bypassed Arthur's formidable mental defenses entirely. They hadn't spoken much. The mutual attraction had been an immediate, chemical flashpoint. Arthur, uncharacteristically driven by a sudden, primal need to be held, had driven them back to his penthouse. The encounter had been intense, bordering on desperate, but handled with a profound, aching tenderness that Arthur had never experienced in his life. The alpha had treated him like something incredibly precious, shielding him, scenting him thoroughly, and whispering soft, sweet praise into the crook of his neck. When Arthur woke up the next morning, the primal fog had cleared, replaced by a cold, paralyzing panic. He had dressed silently, left a terse, formal note on the nightstand, and fled to the safety of his corporate empire before the alpha even stirred. He hadn't even asked for the man's last name. His name was Toby. That was all Arthur knew. A sudden, sharp spike of nausea snapped Arthur back to the present. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white as his stomach violently churned. He barely made it to the private executive restroom attached to his office before collapsing to his knees in front of the porcelain bowl. He retched, his entire body trembling as he emptied what little was left in his stomach. Wiping his mouth with a cold damp towel, Arthur stared at his reflection in the mirror. He looked pale. His cheeks were slightly sunken, but his skin had an unusual, luminous sheen. With trembling fingers, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, white box he had bought from a 24-hour pharmacy in the middle of the night, a purchase driven by a late-night panic attack he had dismissed as irrational. 10 minutes later, Arthur sat on the edge of his pristine office sofa, staring at the plastic stick on the glass coffee table. Two solid, unmistakable pink lines stared back at him. Positive. The cold, unshakable CEO of Vance Global Holdings felt the room tilt on its axis. He was an Omega. He was unmarried. He was the head of a multi-billion-dollar empire. And he was pregnant by a stranger who smelled like a bakery. Tobias Sterling pulled a fresh tray of pain-o chocolate from the massive deck ovens of the Golden Crumb, his eyes crinkling with satisfaction as the rich, buttery aroma filled the air. At 6'3", with thick forearms covered in flour and dusted with a tattoo of a wheat stalk, Toby looked more like a lumberjack or a security guard than an artisanal baker. But baking was his soul. He loved the patience of it. The way simple elements, flour, water, yeast, time, could transform into something that brought pure, unadulterated joy to people. "Toby, your 10 o'clock catering order is packed and ready," called out Maya, his head assistant, as she wiped down the front counter. "It's for that massive corporate building down on 5th, Vance Global." They ordered the premium executive assortment. Toby's heart gave a strange, familiar thud at the mention of the name. Vance. For 6 weeks, Toby had been living in a state of suspended animation. He couldn't stop thinking about the sleek, ethereal Omega he had met at the lounge. The man had looked like an ice sculpture dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, but underneath that frozen exterior, Toby had felt a desperate, beautiful warmth. They had shared a night of incredible, soul-stirring intimacy. Toby had fallen hard and fast, his alpha instinct screaming at him that this was his mate. But he had woken up to a cold bed and a note that read, "Thank you for the evening. Please do not attempt to contact me." This was a singular event. Toby had been devastated. He had gone back to the lounge every night for a week, hoping, but the ice prince had vanished. "Earth to Toby," Maya laughed, waving a hand in front of his face. "Are you going to deliver this, or should I send the intern?" "No, I'll take it," Toby said, shaking himself out of his reverie. "I need some fresh air anyway." He packed the heavy, temperature-controlled delivery boxes into his van and drove through the bustling city streets. When he arrived at the Vance Global headquarters, he was struck by how imposing it was. It was a monument to glass and steel, completely devoid of warmth. He walked into the lobby, carrying the massive wooden crates of pastries. The security guard eyed his flour-dusted apron and denim shirt with mild amusement. "Catering for the 50th floor executive boardroom. Name's Sterling. Go right up, man. They're waiting for these. Big merger meeting today." Toby stepped into the glass elevator. As the floors clicked past, the air pressure changed, and so did the atmosphere. When the doors opened onto the 50th floor, Toby felt an immediate shift. The floor was beautiful, but clinical. He was directed by a sharp-looking secretary toward a pair of massive double doors. "Just lay them out on the side buffet table, please. They are taking a 15-minute recess before the final voting." Toby nodded, pushing the doors open. The room was empty for the moment, the long mahogany table littered with tablets, legal pads, and half-empty water bottles. He began unpacking his creations, warm, flaky croissants, delicate raspberry tarts, and his signature cinnamon-infused brioche rolls. As he set down the final tray, the heavy double doors opened. Toby turned around, a polite customer service smile on his face, but the smile froze. Walking into the room, flanked by two older men in sharp suits, was the Ice Prince. He was wearing a flawless navy suit, his dark hair parted perfectly. But he looked incredibly pale. Arthur Vance stopped dead in his tracks. His blue eyes widened in absolute shock as his gaze locked onto Toby. For a second, the heavy scent blockers Arthur wore seemed to fail in Toby's mind. Toby's powerful alpha senses caught it. Underneath the chemical masking, there was the faint, unmistakable scent of silver needle tea, but it was altered. It was sweeter, heavier, tinged with a delicate, milky warmth that made Toby's inner alpha sit up in absolute, roaring alertness. It was the scent of an omega who was nesting. An omega who was carrying. Arthur's hand instinctively flew to his lower abdomen for a fraction of a second before he dropped it, his face instantly smoothing back into a mask of pure, unbothered frost. Who authorized an external vendor inside the executive suite during a closed session? Arthur asked, his voice cutting through the room like winter ice. He wasn't looking at the executives, his eyes were pinned entirely on Toby. Mr. Vance, this is the catering from the Golden Crumb, the secretary whispered anxiously from the doorway. You requested pastries for the board members to sustain them through the afternoon vote. Toby didn't care about the corporate hierarchy. He took 2 large steps forward, his eyes fixed on Arthur's pale face. Arthur. It's you. You're. Toby sniffed the air again, his chest heaving as the realization slammed into him with the force of a freight train. His eyes dropped to Arthur's completely flat stomach, then back to his eyes. You're pregnant. The entire room went dead silent. The 2 vice presidents looked like they had just witnessed an alien landing. Arthur didn't blink, though a tiny, nearly imperceptible muscle twitched in his jaw. I do not know who you are, or what kind of delusional extortion scheme you are attempting, Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm, steady, and loud enough for everyone to hear. But you will leave my building immediately before I have security throw you out. Toby stood his ground, his soft heart aching at the sheer distress he could sense hiding beneath Arthur's cold facade. Arthur, please. I know your scent. I know what I'm smelling. You're carrying my pup. Security, Arthur spoke clearly into his lapel microphone, his gaze never wavering from Toby's. Remove the caterer from the 50th floor. And ensure his business is blacklisted from all Vance Global properties permanently. 2 heavily armed security guards burst into the room within 30 seconds. Toby looked at Arthur, seeing the rigid, terrified posture masked as corporate dominance. He didn't want to cause a scene that would distress the Omega further. I'm going, Toby said softly, raising his hands. He looked directly into Arthur's icy blue eyes, his voice dripping with an unshakable, gentle promise. But I'm not giving up on you, Arthur. Or our baby. You're pale, and you look like you haven't eaten a solid meal in weeks. I'll be back. As the guards escorted Toby out, Arthur stood perfectly still. The moment the doors shut, he grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Mr. Vance? Are you all right? Julian asked, stepping forward. The meeting is adjourned until tomorrow, Arthur commanded, his voice shaking slightly despite his best efforts. Leave. All of you. When they were gone, Arthur collapsed into his leather chair. He buried his face in his hands, the rich, intoxicating scent of warm vanilla, sugar, and cinnamon from the pastries filling the room, mocking his carefully constructed isolation. He was compromised. His secret was out to the worst possible person, the father. The morning sun had barely begun to illuminate the glass facade of Vance Global Holdings when Arthur arrived at his office. It was 6 a.m. His assistant, a terrifyingly efficient beta named Evelyn, was already at her desk. Arthur looked, if possible, even more immaculate than the day before. His charcoal pinstripe suit was tailored to perfection, and he had doubled his dosage of scent blockers. No one, absolutely no one, could be allowed to believe the absurd, scandalous accusation leveled by the baker the previous afternoon. He had spent the night reviewing legal strategies, drafting non-disclosure agreements, and consulting with his private, highly confidential physician. He was in control. He was Arthur Vance. "Evelyn," Arthur said as he glided past her desk. "Has the security team updated the guest protocols for the executive floor?" "Yes, Mr. Vance," Evelyn replied, her voice crisp. "Mr. Sterling's name, physical description, and delivery vehicle have been flagged. He will not be permitted past the perimeter gates, let alone the elevators." "Excellent. Bring me the Q3 risk assessment files." Arthur closed his office door, letting out a breath he felt he'd been holding since yesterday. He sat down, opening his tablet. He had a packed schedule, a 9 a.m. briefing with the legal team, a 10:30 a.m. presentation to the board regarding the tech acquisition, and a lunch meeting with foreign investors. There was no room for distractions. No room for soft-hearted alphas who smelled like a Sunday morning. By 9:45 a.m., Arthur was in the middle of tearing apart a junior partner's market analysis when the heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom groaned open. Arthur didn't look up immediately. "I believe I made it clear that this meeting was not to be interrupted, Evelyn." "She didn't interrupt, Artie." "I did." Arthur's head snapped up. The entire room went cold. Standing in the doorway was Tobias Sterling. He wasn't wearing his baking apron today. Instead, he wore a clean, well-fitted dark green flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, dark jeans, and a pair of heavy work boots. In his hands, he held a large, beautifully lacquered wicker basket lined with a gingham cloth. The scent of warm, caramelized apples, flaky butter crust, and rich, decadent vanilla immediately breached the room's clinical atmosphere. "How did you get past security?" Arthur demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. He stood up, leaning his hands on the table. "I personally blacklisted you from this building." Toby offered a warm, totally unbothered smile that crinkled the corners of his hazel eyes. "Well, your security guards are big guys, Artie. But it turns out the night shift hadn't eaten breakfast, and the morning shift really loves fresh, hot apple cinnamon turnovers. I brought 3 dozen. We're friends now." A collective, quiet gasp went around the table of lawyers. "Get out," Arthur hissed, his scent blockers working overtime as his inner Omega thrashed in a volatile mix of fury and an embarrassing, deep-seated urge to whimpering at the smell of the pastries. His stomach, which had been in knots all morning, suddenly let out a loud, traitorous rumble. Toby's expression softened instantly. He walked right past the stunned legal team, setting the heavy basket directly onto the pristine, multi-million-dollar mahogany boardroom table. "You haven't eaten breakfast," Toby said, his voice dropping to that low, rumbling alpha register that made Arthur's knees feel dangerously weak. "Your secretary said you arrived at 6. You're pale, your skin is dry, and you're burning through your reserves. I don't care if you're mad at me, Arthur, but you are going to eat. I will have you arrested for trespassing," Arthur threatened, though his voice lacked its usual cutting edge. He was staring at the basket. Toby flipped back the gingham cloth. Inside lay an assortment of perfectly golden turnovers, their tops glittering with coarse sugar, still steaming. Beside them sat a thermos. "It's ginger and red bush tea," Toby murmured gently, pouring a cup. "Good for morning sickness. Safe for the baby. No caffeine." The lawyers were staring at Arthur, waiting for the execution. Arthur Vance did not tolerate insubordination. He did not tolerate interruptions. He certainly did not tolerate bakers treating him like a fragile spouse. Arthur stared at the tea. The scent of ginger was piercing through his nausea like a lifeline. He looked at Toby, whose eyes were filled with nothing but genuine, unearned devotion. "Everyone leave the room," Arthur commanded quietly. "Mr. Vance," the lead counsel asked, bewildered. "Should we call the police?" "Leave," Arthur repeated, his eyes never leaving Toby's face. The room emptied in record time. The moment the heavy doors clicked shut, Arthur sank back into his chair, looking less like a corporate tyrant and more like a thoroughly exhausted man. You are disrupting my entire infrastructure, Arthur said, his voice tight. I'm taking care of my mate, Toby corrected softly, pulling up a chair right next to the CEO, a chair no one dared occupy without permission. He pushed the warm cup of tea into Arthur's cold hands. Drink. Please, Arthur. Just a sip. Arthur glared at him, but the overwhelming craving won. He lifted the cup to his lips and took a sip. The warmth bloomed in his chest, and almost instantly, the violent churning in his stomach subsided. It was infuriatingly perfect. This changes nothing, Arthur snapped, though he took another sip. I am the CEO of a global entity. I do not have time for cookies. Or whatever this fantasy is. This pregnancy is a private matter. I will handle it medically, and I will provide you with a financial settlement for your contribution. Toby's warm aura flared, a sudden, protective dominance rippling through his scent that made Arthur's breath catch. Toby reached out, his large, warm hand covering Arthur's pale fingers on the teacup. I don't want your money, Arthur, Toby said, his voice fierce but completely tender. I want you. And I want this baby. You can run this whole city from up here, but when you're done, I'm going to be the one who feeds you. Get used to it. By the following week, the 50th floor of Vance Global Holdings had descended into what Arthur could only describe as a tactical occupation. Despite changing security codes, issuing memos, and even threatening terminations, Arthur could not stop the baked goods. Toby had effectively subverted the entire corporate hierarchy through the strategic deployment of carbohydrates. The security guards now openly waved his delivery van through. The receptionists gave him scheduling updates. Even Evelyn, Arthur's fiercely loyal assistant, had been compromised. Arthur had caught her hiding a lemon poppy seed scone in her desk drawer. It was Tuesday morning, the day of the highly critical Q3 shareholder briefing. Arthur was standing at the front of the main auditorium, adjusting his presentation clicker. This meeting would dictate the company's stock valuation for the next 6 months. He needed to be flawless. He wore an impeccably tailored navy three-piece suit, designed to compress and hide the tiny, practically invisible thickening of his waistline. He was determined to be the picture of cold, untouchable efficiency. The shareholders, a sea of elite alphas and betas in gray suits, filled the auditorium. Arthur took the podium, his voice clear and resonant as he began detailing the logistics merger. As you can see from the projected data on slide 4, our synergy metrics indicate an upward trajectory of. The heavy double doors at the back of the auditorium swung open. Arthur froze mid-sentence. Toby walked in, wearing his signature flannel shirt, carrying a massive, insulated catering tray. The scent of fresh, hot brioche buns stuffed with savory spinach, feta, and caramelized onions instantly obliterated the sterile, air-conditioned scent of the auditorium. A murmur rippled through the hundreds of elite shareholders. What is the meaning of this? A major investor from the front row demanded, sniffing the air. Is this a scheduled break? Toby smiled broadly, walking right down the center aisle toward the stage. Apologies for the interruption, ladies and gentlemen. But the CEO skipped breakfast today due to an early board review, and he needs his protein and complex carbs to sustain his cognitive function during high-stress presentations. Arthur's face burned a furious, bright crimson beneath his pale skin. Mr. Sterling, he said through clenched teeth, his microphone picking up his sharp intake of breath. You are entirely out of order. Leave the stage. Toby climbed the steps to the stage, completely unfazed by the glares of 200 billionaires. He walked right up to the podium, setting a small, elegant plate containing a warm, savory brioche and a fresh cup of red bush tea directly next to Arthur's high-tech control panel. Eat half of it, Artie, Toby murmured, his voice too quiet for the microphone to catch but carrying the heavy, commanding warmth of a worried alpha. Your scent is spiking. You're getting dizzy. I can smell the fatigue from the back of the room. Arthur wanted to order his execution. He wanted to scream. But as he looked down at the savory bun, his mouth watered so intensely it was physically painful. His body, depleted by the growing pup inside him, practically begged for the nourishment. His vision had, in fact, gone slightly blurry a moment ago. The shareholders watched in absolute, stunned silence as the terrifying, ice-cold Arthur Vance stared at the pastry, lifted a shaking hand, and took a delicate, desperate bite. The flavor explosion was immediate, rich, warm, comforting, and perfectly balanced. Arthur swallowed, his posture visibly relaxing as the nutrients hit his system. He took a sip of the warm tea, his nausea dissolving instantly. He looked at Toby, who was watching him with a look of such profound, unadulterated pride and affection that something inside Arthur's frozen chest cracked just a little. Arthur cleared his throat, turning back to the microphone, his voice regaining its absolute, terrifying authority. As I was saying, the synergy metrics indicate an upward trajectory. Please refer to your handouts. And, pass the tray around. Mr. Sterling's catering is now an official line item expense of this presentation. The shareholders, bewildered but captivated by the incredible scent, eagerly reached for the pastries as Toby walked down the aisle, distributing them with a wink. Later that afternoon, back in his private office, Arthur sat at his desk, staring out the window. The door opened without a knock. Toby walked in, carrying a small box of chocolate-dipped shortbread. "You did well today," Toby said softly, setting the box down. Arthur didn't look at him. "You humiliated me in front of my investors, Tobias." "I fed you in front of your investors," Toby corrected, walking around the desk. He stopped just inches from Arthur's chair. "They saw that you're taken care of. They saw that someone protects the man who protects their money." Arthur looked up, his blue eyes flashing with a sudden, rare vulnerability. "I don't need protecting. I have built this empire alone." Toby leaned down, placing his large, warm hands on the armrests of Arthur's chair, effectively trapping the CEO. He didn't crowd him aggressively, instead, he bathed him in his rich, soothing scent of vanilla and warm sugar. "You built it alone, Artie," Toby whispered, his hazel eyes fierce with devotion. "But you don't have to carry the weight of it alone anymore. Let me in. Let me take care of you. Both of you." For the first time in his life, Arthur didn't push an alpha away. He leaned forward slightly, his forehead resting against Toby's chest, inhaling the scent that had become his only sanctuary. "You are incredibly annoying," Arthur muttered into the flannel shirt. Toby wrapped his strong arms around the ice CEO, pulling him close. "I know, sweetheart. I know. Now, eat your shortbread." The transition from late autumn to early winter brought a biting chill to the city streets, turning the concrete canyons into wind tunnels. But inside the executive offices of Vance Global Holdings, the temperature had reached a comfortable, unprecedented warmth. Arthur sat at his desk, a sleek pair of reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he reviewed the acquisition documents for a European logistics firm. He was nearing his 14th week of pregnancy. To the untrained eye, his tailored black wool suit still fit immaculately, but Arthur knew the truth. Every morning, the trousers felt a fraction of an inch tighter, and the silk vests had to be let out by his private tailor under a strict non-disclosure agreement. His scent was becoming harder to mask. Even with the highest permitted dosage of pregnancy-safe blockers, a faint, undeniable sweetness, like fresh milk pouring into premium tea, underlined his usual sharp, clinical ozone. A soft knock sounded at his door. Not waiting for an invitation, Toby stepped inside. He was carrying a wide silver tray today, covered by a domed glass lid. Toby had practically become a fixture on the 50th floor. He had been issued a permanent vendor badge, mostly because Arthur's legal department grew tired of drafting temporary building passes every single morning, but he still wore his uniform of heavy denim or flannel, his forearms dusted with flour. "You're late," Arthur said without looking up from his tablet, though his fingers tightened slightly against the glass screen. "Traffic on the bridge was a nightmare," Toby said, setting the tray down on the coffee table. He walked over to Arthur's desk, naturally stepping into the CEO's personal space. Without asking, he reached out and pressed the back of his large, warm hand against Arthur's cheek. You look tired. Did you sleep through the white noise machine I bought you? I am the chief executive of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, Tobias. I do not sleep through things. I had an overnight conference call with Tokyo, Arthur replied, though he subconsciously leaned a fraction of a millimeter into the warmth of Toby's palm before pulling back with a frown. What did you bring? Ginger-infused palmiers and a warm spiced pear compote, Toby said, pulling back the glass dome. The rich, buttery scent of caramelized sugar and baking spice instantly filled the sterile room. And don't look at me like that. The ginger settles your morning nausea, and the pears have the fiber your doctor said you're lacking. Arthur scoffed, but he rose from his desk nonetheless, his body practically moving on autopilot toward the couch. Over the past month, his body had developed a profound, humiliating reliance on Toby's baking. If he tried to eat the standard executive lunches prepared by the corporate catering staff, his stomach violently rejected them. But Toby's food? His system welcomed it like a starved man. He sat down, picking up a delicate, elephant ear-shaped pastry. It shattered beautifully under his teeth, the perfect balance of sweet sugar and sharp, warming ginger coating his tongue. Arthur let out a soft, involuntary sound of approval from the back of his throat. Toby sat beside him, his massive frame sinking into the expensive Italian leather sofa. He didn't push for conversation, he simply let his heavy, soothing alpha scent wash over the room, creating an invisible, protective bubble around the pregnant Omega. The board is murmuring, Arthur said after his second pastry, his voice resuming its customary cool edge. They are noticing the frequency of your visits. Julian has been making inquiries with human resources regarding unvetted external personnel having access to private executive chambers. Toby chuckled, his thick chest rumbling against Arthur's shoulder. Let Julian complain. I brought his administrative assistant a box of raspberry cronets this morning. If he tries to file a complaint, she'll lose the paperwork in the system for at least 3 weeks. Arthur stared at him, a rare, microscopic twitch of amusement at the corner of his lips. You are running a corporate espionage ring using puff pastry. It's called community relations, Artie, Toby smiled, reaching out to gently brush a stray flake of pastry from the corner of Arthur's mouth. His thumb lingered on Arthur's lower lip for a second too long, his hazel eyes darkening with a sudden, heavy affection. How's the little sprout doing today? Any kicking? It is entirely too early for fetal movement, Tobias, Arthur said, though his hand instinctively rose to rest over his lower abdomen. It is currently the size of a lemon. A Meyer lemon, Toby murmured, his hand covering Arthur's, his warmth seeping through the expensive wool of the suit. Sweet, a little tart, and completely perfect. Arthur looked at their joined hands. For a man who had spent his entire adult life building walls to keep alphas from controlling him, he found himself remarkably defenseless against a man who simply wanted to make sure he was fed. The crisis hit on a Thursday in early December. A sudden, aggressive short-selling attack on Vance Global's tech stock had triggered a minor panic in the market. By 2 p.m., Arthur had been trapped in the main war room for 6 consecutive hours, surrounded by frantic analysts, furious board members, and a mountain of legal briefs. The room was thick with the acrid, aggressive pheromones of stressed, dominant alphas. The air felt heavy, toxic, and hot. Arthur stood at the head of the long table, his face a pale, frozen mask. His head was pounding with a vicious intensity, and a sharp, pulling ache had formed in his lower back. He could feel his inner Omega crying out, suffocating under the hostile sense in the room, desperately wanting to flee to a safe, quiet nest. If we don't dump the secondary stock options by the closing bell, we're going to lose 40 million in liquidity. Julian shouted, slamming his fist onto the table. His aggressive alpha scent, sour pine and stale sweat, flared violently in his panic. We are not dumping anything, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low, freezing register that temporarily silenced the room. A fire sale is exactly what the short sellers want. We hold our position. We buy back the shares through our shell entity at 3:30 p.m. when the price bottoms out. That is a massive gamble, Vance, another executive yelled, leaning forward aggressively, his scent rolling off him in waves of dominant intimidation. You're risking our capital on a hunch. Arthur felt a sudden wave of dizziness hit him. The room tilted. The hostile pheromones were choking him, making it hard to draw a full breath. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning translucent, praying his legs wouldn't give out. He was a Vance. He could not show weakness. Suddenly, the heavy doors to the war room burst open. The frantic executives turned, ready to tear into whoever had dared interrupt a high-stakes crisis meeting. Toby stood in the doorway. He wasn't smiling today. His broad shoulders were squared, and his hazel eyes were sharp, scanning the room until they locked onto Arthur's pale, trembling form. The moment Toby stepped into the room, his powerful, protective alpha presence exploded outward, completely obliterating the sour, aggressive pheromones of the other men. He smelled of deep, dark chocolate, toasted espresso beans, and a heavy, molten note of protective cinnamon. It was an alpha-dominant display, but instead of aggression, it felt like a massive, impenetrable shield. Who the hell let you in here? Julian roared, standing up. We are in the middle of a market emergency. Toby didn't even look at him. He marched straight down the length of the room, his heavy boots echoing on the hardwood. He stopped right beside Arthur. Without a care for the corporate audience, Toby wrapped a massive, solid arm around Arthur's waist, pulling the trembling CEO firmly against his side, offering his scent gland directly to Arthur's nose. He's done for the day, Toby announced to the room, his deep baritone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Are you insane? Julian gasped. Vance, tell this lunatic to get out. Arthur, completely overwhelmed by the sudden influx of Toby's safe, warm scent, let out a tiny, broken sigh. He leaned his forehead directly into the crook of Toby's neck, inhaling the dark chocolate and cinnamon like a drowning man catching a breath of oxygen. His fingers gripped the fabric of Toby's flannel shirt, holding on for dear life. The instructions stand, Arthur managed to say, his voice muffled against Toby's neck but still audible to the room. Execute the buyback at 3:30. Julian is in charge of the execution. Any deviations will result in immediate termination. Arthur, you can't just leave, Julian started. Toby turned his head, his eyes flashing with a primal, dangerous alpha warning that made Julian instantly step back, his own sense subverting in the face of a clearly superior, highly protective mate instinct. I said, Toby rumbled, he is done. If any of you have a problem with that, you can come down to my bakery tomorrow morning and discuss it with me. Otherwise, clear out. Without waiting for a response, Toby lifted Arthur cleanly off his feet, cradling the CEO against his broad chest. Arthur was too exhausted, too overwhelmed, and too secretly relieved to protest. He buried his face in Toby's neck, closing his eyes as Toby carried him out of the toxic room, down the private executive elevator, and straight out to the waiting delivery van, leaving the billion-dollar empire behind to follow his commands in their absence. The leather interior of Toby's delivery van didn't smell like luxury, it smelled like yeast, flour sacks, and old-fashioned hard work. For Arthur, who had spent his entire life insulated by the clinical sense of leather treatments and high-end air purifiers, the interior of the vehicle felt like an alternate universe. Toby drove with a calm, unhurried precision, one large hand resting gently on Arthur's knee. The furious, protective edge his scent had carried in the boardroom had softened, melting back into a thick, sweet wave of brown sugar and baked vanilla. Where are we going? Arthur asked, his voice still small, his fingers lightly tracing the seam of his tailored trousers. His headache was finally beginning to recede, chased away by the proximity of his alpha. My penthouse is in the opposite direction. We're going to my place, Toby said easily, negotiation entirely absent from his tone. Your penthouse is beautiful, Artie, but it's as cold as an icebox. You've got nothing in the fridge but alkaline water and organic green juice. You need real food, and you need to rest where I can keep an eye on you. Arthur opened his mouth to object, to demand he be taken to his fortress of solitude where he could monitor the stock buyback, but his body traitorously relaxed into the passenger seat. The pulling ache in his lower back had eased, replaced by a heavy, fluid warmth. I have a laptop in my briefcase. I need to check the market closing numbers at 4 p.m. I'll give you 15 minutes on your computer, Toby conceded, pulling the van into the alley behind the Golden Crumb. After that, it's strictly offline. Toby's apartment sat directly above the bakery. It was a spacious, open-concept loft with exposed brick walls, thick wooden beams, and a massive, oversized kitchen that took up half the floor space. It was messy in a comfortable way, flour bags stacked near the pantry, cookbooks piled on the coffee table, and a massive, plush sofa covered in knitted blankets. The moment Arthur stepped across the threshold, his inner Omega practically purred. The space was completely saturated with Toby's comforting, dominant scent. It felt like an accidental nest, pre-warmed and waiting for him. Sit, Toby commanded softly, guiding Arthur to a heavy wooden stool at the kitchen island. Don't touch your phone yet. Drink this first. Toby disappeared into the pantry, returning with a tall glass of fresh buttermilk blended with roasted almonds and a hint of cardamom. Old family recipe for stress. Drink up. Arthur took a tentative sip. It was cold, rich, and incredibly soothing against his raw throat. As he drank, he watched Toby move around the kitchen. The alpha was incredibly deft for his size. He grabbed a large earthenware bowl filled with a proofing brioche dough, punching it down with a rhythmic, mesmerizing force. His forearms flexed, the wheatstock tattoo shifting under his skin. Why do you do it? Arthur asked suddenly, his blue eyes tracking the movement of Toby's hands. The baking. You could easily expand this into a franchise, automate the process, maximize your profit margins. Yet you stay in this single location, doing the manual labor yourself. Toby stopped, looking up with a soft, crinkling smile. Because you can't mass-produce love, Artie. When I need this dough, my heat goes into it. My energy goes into it. If I let a machine do it, it's just calories. When I do it, it's comfort. People taste the difference. He set the bowl aside and walked around the counter, stepping close to Arthur. He reached out, his thick, flour-dusted fingers gently catching Arthur's chin, lifting his head. Just like you can't manage a pregnancy with a spreadsheet. You're trying to optimize a miracle, sweetheart. You have to let it happen. Arthur's breath hitched. He felt completely exposed under Toby's warm, honest gaze. It's terrifying, Arthur whispered, the confession slipping past his frozen defenses before he could stop it. I have never depended on anyone, Tobias. If I am not strong, everything I built falls apart. Toby leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to Arthur's forehead. He smelled like raw flour and unconditional devotion. Then let it fall apart for an hour. I'll help you rebuild it before breakfast. By January, the dynamic at Vance Global Holdings had undergone a permanent, surreal evolution. The short-selling attack had failed spectacularly. Arthur's strategy had saved the firm $40 million and crushed the rival hedge fund, but the board had learned a valuable lesson. If they pushed the CEO too hard, a 6'3" baker would appear out of nowhere to carry him away. Consequently, the executives had become shockingly polite. Arthur was now 5 months pregnant. The tiny, subtle curve of his stomach had blossomed into a distinct, rounded swell that could no longer be hidden by clever tailoring. He had abandoned his three-piece suits for soft, high-end cashmere sweaters and custom-tailored trousers with elastic waistbands, a concession that Toby had celebrated by bringing a triple chocolate mousse cake to the office. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and Arthur was hosting a high-level budget review. He sat at the head of the table, a cup of red bush tea resting on his belly, which he used as a convenient, makeshift shelf. The allocation for the research and development sector needs to be increased by 12%, Arthur stated, his voice still carrying its trademark authority, though it was softened by a deep, maternal resonance that had begun to develop. The door to the boardroom opened quietly. Evelyn walked in, carrying a large silver platter. But she wasn't alone. Walking right behind her, wearing a tiny, custom-made white baker's apron, was a 5-year-old girl with bright hazel eyes and a halo of curly brown hair. "Mr. Vance," Evelyn said, trying to maintain her professional decorum despite the child clinging to her leg. "Mr. Sterling had an emergency with a broken mixer downstairs in the delivery van, and he asked if his niece could wait here for 10 minutes. The entire boardroom of elite executives blinked in unison. "Arthur," the little girl squealed, breaking away from Evelyn and sprinting down the length of the room. Arthur's frozen expression dissolved instantly into something breathtakingly soft. He pushed his chair back, catching the little girl as she threw her arms around his neck. "Hello, Lily," he murmured, his scent expanding into a warm, creamy wave of silver needle tea and rich, sweet honey. "Are you helping your uncle today?" Uncle Toby made giant cinnamon rolls. Lily declared proudly, pointing to the platter Evelyn was setting down. "He said you need extra icing because the baby is growing fast." Julian, who had once been Arthur's harshest critic, cleared his throat. "Well, the cinnamon rolls do smell exceptional, Mr. Vance. Perhaps we could take a 10-minute recess to address the pastry logistics." Arthur looked at his board of directors, all of them looking at the pastries like eager school children. "Very well. 10 minutes. Julian, ensure Lily gets a glass of milk." While the executives scrambled to get their treats, Arthur sat back, Lily happily chattering on his lap about a puppy she had seen in the park. The door opened again, and Toby stepped in, wiping his grease-stained hands on a towel. He looked tired, but the moment his eyes found Arthur, his face lit up. He walked over, dropping a heavy kiss on Lily's head, and then leaned down to press his lips firmly against Arthur's cheek. His large hand slid naturally under Arthur's cashmere sweater, resting directly against the warm, bare skin of his rounded belly. The baby inside gave a sudden, hard kick right against Toby's palm. Toby froze, his hazel eyes widening in absolute awe. "Did you feel that?" he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I feel it every day, Tobias," Arthur smiled softly, his hand resting over Toby's. "It likes your scent. Every time you come into the room, it starts doing gymnastics." Toby let out a low, emotional rumble, leaning down to press his forehead against Arthur's shoulder. The fierce, untouchable CEO of Vance Global Holdings sat in front of his entire executive board, surrounded by the smell of cinnamon and sugar, completely content to be held by the baker who had ruined his carefully constructed isolation, and given him a home instead. By the time February arrived, the executive suite on the 50th floor had ceased to look like a cutting-edge center of venture capitalism and more like an upscale, corporate-styled nursery. Arthur was officially 7 months pregnant, and the physical reality of carrying an alpha's pup was thoroughly dismantling his carefully cultivated detachment. His usual scent blockers had been completely discontinued on strict medical advice. The synthetic hormones were a risk to the baby's third trimester lung development. As a result, the entire 50th floor smelled perpetually of Arthur's true, unmasked dynamic, a rich, velvety silver needle tea laced with a heavy, deeply sweet note of wild clover honey. It was an intoxicating scent that had a bizarrely calming effect on the entire company. For the past 2 weeks, productivity had skyrocketed, and interpersonal conflicts among the staff had dropped to historic lows. Arthur, however, was miserable. He sat at his desk, his lower back throbbing fiercely. His ankles were swollen, his silk shirt felt like sandpaper against his sensitive skin, and his inner Omega was experiencing a sudden, wildly irrational urge to assemble a nest. For 3 days, he had been fighting the instinct to drag the plush cashmere throws from his private lounge and pile them under his desk. "Mr. Vance," Evelyn said softly over the intercom. "The overseas legal team is ready to review the compliance parameters for the European merger. They are waiting in the main boardroom." Arthur groaned, pushing himself up from his chair. His stomach was a large, heavy, perfect sphere beneath his soft cream-colored sweater. He felt cumbersome and physically vulnerable, 2 things Arthur Vance despised being. When he entered the boardroom, he found the atmosphere tense. The Overseas Legal Counsel consisted of 3 highly traditional, unbonded alpha attorneys who had been flown in specifically for their aggressive negotiation reputation. The moment Arthur walked in, their eyes dropped to his prominent belly, their scent spiking with a subtle, dismissive note of dominance. They saw an Omega in late-stage pregnancy, they smelled vulnerability. Mr. Vance, the lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Montgomery, said with a patronizing smile. "We were hoping we could expedite this review. We understand that in your current condition, prolonged cognitive exertion can be fatiguing." Arthur's eyes flashed with a sudden, dangerous frost. He sat down at the head of the table, his posture instantly turning rigid. "My condition, Mr. Montgomery, has no bearing on my cognitive capacity. If you had reviewed the data I sent to your team at 4 a.m., you would know that your compliance parameters are short by 3 key regulatory filings. Now, sit down, open your tablets, and let us correct your oversights." Montgomery's smile vanished, his scent turning sour and combative. "We believe our filings are perfectly adequate, Mr. Vance. Perhaps your judgment is being slightly clouded by..." The boardroom doors flew open with a loud, resounding thud. Toby marched into the room, looking like a force of nature. He was wearing his heavy canvas work apron over a flannel shirt, his forearms dusted with flour, but his face was set in a dark, thunderous expression. He had caught the scent of the hostile alphas the moment he stepped off the elevator. In his hands, he carried a massive, deep wooden tray. But it didn't contain his usual elegant pastries. Instead, it held a massive, deep dish of freshly baked, bubbling, golden brown brioche bread pudding, thick with heavy cream, toasted pecans, and a rich bourbon vanilla glaze. The scent was thick, heavy, and completely overpowering, dropping like a velvet hammer over the room's hostile tension. "Who invited the baker?" Montgomery snapped, standing up, his alpha instincts bristling at Toby's massive size. Toby didn't even acknowledge him. He walked straight to the head of the table, set the heavy, steaming tray down right in front of Arthur, and then did something that made the overseas legal team gasp in absolute shock. Toby reached behind him, grabbed the plush, oversized faux fur throw blanket he had secretly brought from Arthur's private lounge, and began arranging it meticulously around Arthur's chair. He tucked it behind Arthur's lower back, draped a portion of it over the CEO's lap, and then pulled a large, soft velvet cushion from his bag, placing it directly under Arthur's swollen feet. "Tobias," Arthur whispered, his face burning a bright crimson, though his inner Omega was practically screaming with joy at the sudden, perfect nest being constructed around him. "We are in the middle of a high-level international negotiation." "I don't care if you're negotiating a treaty with Mars, Artie," Toby rumbled, his voice dropping into a thick, deeply resonant alpha growl that made the 3 overseas attorneys instantly lock their jaws. "These men are scenting the room aggressively, your back hurts, and you haven't had your afternoon fats and proteins." Toby scooped a massive portion of the warm, decadent bread pudding onto a plate and handed a silver spoon to Arthur. "Eat," Toby commanded softly, his hand resting firmly on the back of Arthur's neck, his thumb gently massaging the sensitive scent gland there, deliberately flooding Arthur's system with his own soothing, dominant aroma of warm sugar and toasted espresso. "I'll handle the room." Arthur, completely overwhelmed by the sheer comfort of the makeshift nest and the intoxicating aroma of the pudding, lifted the spoon with a shaking hand and took a bite. The rich, warm cream and sweet vanilla exploded on his tongue, and he let out a soft, helpless sigh, his entire body going beautifully limp against the plush cushions. Toby turned his gaze to the 3 attorneys, his hazel eyes completely devoid of warmth. His massive shoulders squared, and his scent flared into a suffocating, hyperprotective wall of dark chocolate and molten cinnamon. "Mr. Montgomery, is it?" Toby said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "The compliance parameters Mr. Vance mentioned are non-negotiable. You will adjust the filings by 5 p.m., or I will personally ensure your firm is stripped of its retainer before the market opens tomorrow. Do we understand each other?" Montgomery looked at the massive, flour-dusted alpha who was currently scenting the multi-billion-dollar CEO like a prized treasure. He looked at Arthur, who was happily eating bread pudding from a nest of fur blankets, completely unbothered. "Yes," Montgomery stammered, his dominance entirely crushed. We will adjust the filings immediately." "Good," Toby nodded, his expression softening back into a warm smile as he looked down at Arthur. "Enjoy your pudding, sweetheart. I'll be in your office waiting to give you a foot rub when you're done." 3 weeks later, the winter chill had begun to give way to the faint, crisp promise of early spring. Inside Arthur's penthouse, the atmosphere was thick with a quiet, domestic tranquility that would have deeply shocked anyone who knew the CEO in a professional context. It was a Saturday evening. Arthur was lying on his side on the massive living room sofa, his head resting in Toby's lap. Toby's large, rough hands were slowly, methodically stroking the heavy, tight curve of Arthur's belly, tracing the shape of the pup resting inside. "It's quiet tonight," Toby murmured, his voice a low rumble in the dimly lit room. "Usually, the little sprout is trying to kick its way through your ribs by now." "The doctor said the pup is dropping into position," Arthur explained softly, his eyes closed as he leaned into the rhythmic stroke of Toby's hand. He was wearing one of Toby's oversized flannel shirts, the hem draping over his bare thighs. He smelled entirely of Toby, vanilla, yeast, and unconditional safety. "The movement will become less frequent now. Space is limited." Toby let out a soft sound, a deep, satisfied alpha purr that vibrated directly against Arthur's temple. "You've been doing less work this week. Evelyn told me you actually left the office at 4 p.m. on Tuesday." "Evelyn is a traitor whom I pay far too much money," Arthur muttered, though there was no heat in his words. He reached up, his slender fingers tangling in the fabric of Toby's shirt. "Tobias, we need to discuss the logistical parameters of the upcoming months." Toby chuckled, kissing the top of Arthur's head. "Parameters? Artie, you're having a baby, not launching an IPO. It requires planning," Arthur insisted, his blue eyes opening, looking up with a rare, fierce intensity. "The board expects me back in the office 3 weeks post-delivery. I have already structured a remote access system that allows me to approve capital allocations from the nursery. However, the child will require a structured schedule, and your bakery operates on highly irregular hours." Toby's hand stopped its rhythmic stroking. He looked down at Arthur, his hazel eyes soft but incredibly serious. "Arthur. Look at me." Arthur shifted slightly, his heavy body protesting the movement, his eyes locked onto the alpha's face. "You're not going back to the office in 3 weeks, Toby said gently, but with an unshakable certainty. "And you're not running a global entity from a nursing chair. You are going to take your parental leave. The board can survive without you for 3 months. If they can't, then you haven't built a company, you've built a cage." Arthur's breath hitched. A sudden, sharp spike of panic flared through his scent, the old, deep-seated fear of losing control rising to the surface. "I cannot simply step away, Tobias. The market is volatile. If I show weakness, if the shareholders think I am compromised by my dynamic." Hey, Toby interrupted softly, leaning down to press his forehead against Arthur's. He wrapped his strong arms completely around the Omega, pulling him securely against his chest, bathing him in a thick, suffocating wave of protective warmth. "Look at what we did to Montgomery. Look at what we did to Julian. They don't think you're weak, Artie. They're terrified of you because they know you have an alpha who will tear the building down if anyone stresses you out." Toby's hand moved back to Arthur's belly, pressing flat against the warm skin. "You spent your whole life fighting to prove you don't need anyone. But you have me now. Let me be the shield for a little while, Arthur. Let me take care of the business of keeping you safe, so you can just focus on being a papa to this little one." Arthur stared at Toby, his defenses completely dissolving. A single, rare tear slipped from the corner of his eye, wetting Toby's flannel shirt. For the first time in his entire life, Arthur Vance felt completely, utterly safe. He closed his eyes, burying his face into the crook of Toby's neck, letting his corporate armor fall away entirely into the scent of warm sugar. 3 months, Arthur whispered into the dark. But not a single day more. Deal, Toby smiled, his heart bursting with love as he held his mate tight against the coming spring. By the arrival of late March, the financial district was hit by a sensational piece of corporate news that sent shockwaves through the market. Vance Global Holdings was officially announcing a multi-million-dollar joint venture, not with a tech startup or an international logistics conglomerate, but with the Golden Crumb. Arthur sat at his desk, his fingers tapping lazily against the glass of his tablet. He was officially 8 months pregnant, and his physical presence was majestic, if somewhat rounder than the financial world was accustomed to. He wore an oversized heather gray cashmere sweater that draped loosely over his massive, low-hanging belly. He had given up on shoes entirely, opting for high-end, memory foam shearling slippers that Toby had personally selected. "The contracts are finalized, Mr. Vance," Evelyn said, entering the room with a stack of documents. She set them down next to a plate of fresh, warm apricot tarts that Toby had dropped off 2 hours prior. The board approved the funding for the corporate wellness and artisanal culinary initiative without a single dissenting vote. Arthur picked up a tart, taking a precise, delicate bite. The sweet, slightly tart apricot jam and flaky, buttery pastry melted on his tongue, instantly sending a wave of contentment through his system. "Of course they did, Evelyn. Julian knows that if he voted against it, his weekly delivery of sourdough would be permanently discontinued." Evelyn smiled warmly. "The transformation of the first-floor lobby is already underway. The employees are calling it the Flour and Finance Initiative. The stock price has actually bumped up 2 points since the rumor leaked." Arthur shook his head, a soft, rare smile tugging at his lips. It was absurd, really. He had spent a decade building a reputation as a ruthless, ice-cold corporate machine, yet his most successful market expansion was being driven entirely by his alpha's baking. Toby had convinced him that a well-fed corporate workforce was a loyal and productive one, and the data was proving him infuriatingly correct. The door opened, and Toby walked in, carrying a large cardboard box. He looked exhausted, running his main bakery while managing the logistical setup for 3 new corporate kiosks inside Vance Global Properties was pushing his physical limits. But the moment his hazel eyes landed on Arthur, the fatigue seemed to wash out of his frame. He dropped the box onto the sofa and walked straight over to the desk, leaning down to press a deep, lingering kiss to Arthur's lips. He tasted like powdered sugar and espresso. "You're working too hard," Arthur said softly, his hand reaching up to trace the dark circles under Toby's eyes. "I'm building an empire, Artie," Toby chuckled, his deep voice rumbling. He moved behind Arthur's chair, his large, capable hands coming down onto Arthur's shoulders, kneading the tight, stressed muscles of his neck. "Just trying to keep up with my mate." Arthur let his head fall back against Toby's chest, letting out a soft sigh as Toby's scent, a thick, rich wave of burnt sugar, vanilla, and protective alpha dominance, washed over him. "The baby has been particularly active today. I believe it is protesting the lack of chocolate in my system." Toby laughed, his hands moving down from Arthur's shoulders to wrap around the heavy, solid sphere of his belly. He pressed his face into the crook of Arthur's neck, inhaling the sweet, intoxicating scent of silver needle tea and honey. "Is that so? Well, it just so happens I brought a trial batch of dark chocolate and sea salt croissants for the new lobby kiosk. I think the CEO needs to personally audit the inventory." "A highly necessary quality control measure," Arthur agreed, his inner Omega purring contentedly as Toby's large hands rubbed soothing circles over his tight skin. The corporate world could wait. Right now, the boardroom baker was exactly where he belonged. The silence of the penthouse was shattered at 2 a.m. by a sudden, sharp gasp. Arthur sat up abruptly in bed, his hands instantly clutching the lower curvature of his belly. A tight, squeezing pain had seized his entire abdomen, radiating around to his lower back with a fierce, crushing intensity that stole the breath from his lungs. Beside him, Toby was awake in an instant. His alpha instincts, finely tuned to Arthur's scent over the past months, picked up the sudden spike of sharp, metallic distress before Arthur could even speak. "Arthur." What is it? Is it time? Toby asked, his voice thick with sleep but instantly laced with an intense, protective panic. He threw back the duvet, his large hands immediately hovering over Arthur, wanting to touch him but terrified of hurting him. I don't know, Arthur managed to squeeze out, his teeth chattering slightly as the contraction slowly released its grip, leaving his muscles trembling. He leaned back against the headboard, his face pale and glistening with a fine sheen of sweat. It was, exceptionally sharp. It felt significantly different from the Braxton Hicks format we recorded last week. Toby was already moving. He grabbed a clean, warm flannel shirt from the closet, gently helping Arthur slide his arms into it, his scent exploding into the room, a thick, heavy cloud of molten cinnamon and deep, commanding chocolate, designed to soothe and ground his distressed mate. Deep breaths, sweetheart. Breathe with me, Toby rumbled, sitting on the edge of the mattress and pulling Arthur against his broad chest. He held Arthur close, his large hand resting flat against the tight belly, waiting, feeling the muscle structure. Let's time the next one. I've got the hospital bag by the door. Arthur leaned into the massive warmth of his alpha, his fingers clutching Toby's forearm with a strength that would have surprised his board of directors. For all his corporate dominance, in this moment, Arthur felt entirely small, raw, and terrified of the monumental physical reality shifting inside him. 10 minutes passed in tense silence. Then 15. Then 20. Arthur's breathing gradually regulated. The crushing pain didn't return, instead, it faded into a dull, familiar ache in his lower back. The tight, rock-hard sensation in his abdomen slowly softened back into its usual heavy fullness. It's stopping, Arthur whispered, a profound sense of embarrassment suddenly washing over his pale features. He looked up at Toby, his blue eyes shifting away. I believe, it was an error in my assessment. A false alarm. Toby let out a long, shuddering breath, his entire frame sagging with relief. He didn't laugh, and he didn't tease. Instead, he wrapped his arms even tighter around Arthur, burying his face in the dark hair, rocking the Omega gently. Hey, no room for data errors in parenting, Artie, Toby murmured softly, a tender chuckle finally breaking through his voice. It's okay. The doctor said the third trimester is full of dress rehearsals. The little sprout is just checking to see if my delivery van is fully gassed up. Arthur let out a soft, shaky breath, his hand coming to rest over Toby's on his stomach. The baby gave a gentle, lazy roll inside, as if confirming the alpha's words. You are entirely too calm about this, Arthur muttered, though he nestled deeper into Toby's chest, his heart finally slowing its frantic pace. I'm the baker, remember? Toby whispered, kissing Arthur's sweat-dampened temple. I know all about the waiting process. Sometimes the dough takes a little longer to proof, and sometimes the oven needs to click a few times before the flame catches. We've got time, Artie. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Arthur closed his eyes, the rich, comforting scent of his alpha wrapping around him like a heavy velvet blanket, shielding him from the dark of the night and the fears of the future. The Ice Prince was completely gone, replaced entirely by a man who was ready to yield everything to the warmth of the baker's fire. The final month of pregnancy turned Arthur's meticulous life into a comedy of broken schedules. At 38 weeks, the formidable CEO of Vance Global Holdings had officially been grounded. Not by his board of directors, and certainly not by his competitors, but by a stubborn, hyper-protective baker and a medical team that refused to negotiate. Arthur sat in the middle of his living room floor, surrounded by a sea of Egyptian cotton blankets, silk pillows, and 3 of Toby's unwashed flannel shirts. He was nesting. He had fought the instinct for days, calling it a primitive evolutionary glitch, until he woke up at 5 a.m. on a Tuesday, dragged every premium cushion off his designer furniture, and began constructing a fortress of softness in the center of the room. His belly was a massive, heavy, low-slung weight that made navigating his own penthouse a logistical nightmare. Mr. Vance, Evelyn's voice chirped quietly through his tablet, which was resting on a velvet pillow. The Q2 audit reports require your digital signature. And Julian is asking if he can send a courier to retrieve the physical documents for the tech sector allocation. Arthur, who was currently wearing a pair of light gray cashmere sweatpants and a shirt that barely covered the bottom curve of his stomach, glared at the camera. Julian can wait until tomorrow, Evelyn. If he sends a courier to my home while I am restructuring my environment, I will have the legal department audit his personal expense reports for the last 5 years. Understood, sir, Evelyn replied instantly, her face a mask of perfect neutrality. I will tell him you are currently in a high-level restructuring session. The front door clicked open, and the heavy, glorious scent of toasted cardamom, brown butter, and dark espresso flooded the penthouse. Arthur's inner Omega instantly perked up, his scent expanding from a slightly stressed tea note to a rich, syrupy honey. Toby stepped into the living room, carrying a large, insulated paper bag. He took one look at Arthur sitting in the center of his textile fortress, surrounded by pillows, and his hazel eyes crinkled with absolute, unadulterated adoration. Well, look at you, Toby murmured, kicking off his boots and walking over in his socks. He didn't mock the nest, he respected it. He approached the edge of the blanket perimeter, waiting for Arthur's silent permission to enter. You've been busy. The ventilation in this apartment is substandard, Arthur said defensively, though his eyes were fixed on the paper bag. I was merely stabilizing my immediate climate. What did you bring? Cardamom buns, fresh out of the oven. Still hot enough to melt the pearl sugar on top, Toby said, stepping into the nest and sitting down right next to Arthur. He didn't care about his flour-dusted jeans touching the expensive silk pillows. He pulled Arthur gently against his side, offering his neck. Arthur didn't hesitate. He leaned his face directly into the crook of Toby's neck, inhaling the deep, rich alpha scent that had become his oxygen. His massive belly rested against Toby's thigh, and the baby inside gave a heavy, slow roll, recognizing its father's proximity. The audit is short by $6 million in the infrastructure sector, Arthur murmured against Toby's skin, his voice finally losing its corporate edge and turning soft, heavy, and exhausted. The audit doesn't matter today, Artie, Toby whispered, his large hand sliding under Arthur's shirt to press flat against the warm, tight skin of his stomach. He rubbed a soothing circle, his thumb tracing the curve where the pup was dropped low, ready for the world. You're burning hot, sweetheart. Your scent is turning thick. I think the logistics are about to change. The shift happened at 4:15 a.m. on a rainy Thursday morning. Arthur didn't wake up to a sharp pain this time. He woke up to a strange, internal pop, followed instantly by a warm, heavy rush of fluid that soaked through the bedsheets. He sat up, his breath catching in his throat as a dull, crushing wave of pressure seized his lower abdomen, far lower and heavier than any contraction he had felt before. Tobias, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, tight whisper as he reached out to shake the alpha's shoulder. Tobias, the fluid dynamics have changed. My water has broken. Toby was alert before Arthur even finished the sentence. The room was instantly filled with a thick, heavy wave of molten chocolate and sharp cinnamon, Toby's protective instinct flaring to life as he scented the air, catching the metallic, sweet tang of amniotic fluid. I've got you. I've got you, Artie, Toby said, his voice steady, anchoring the panicked Omega. He didn't fumble. He didn't rush. He had spent 9 months preparing for this exact batch of dough to rise. He helped Arthur out of bed, guiding him into a fresh, dry pair of clothes and a massive, oversized winter coat. Within 10 minutes, they were in the back of Toby's delivery van, the interior pre-warmed and heavily scented with Toby's clothes to keep Arthur's instincts quiet during the drive. By the time they reached the private maternity wing of the hospital, Arthur's contractions were coming every 4 minutes. The ice-cold CEO was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, primal creature that clung to Toby's flannel shirt with both hands, his face buried in the alpha's neck as they wheeled him into the delivery room. Mr. Vance, your dilation is at 6 centimeters, the physician said calmly, checking the monitors. You're making excellent progress. The baby is perfectly positioned. Arthur let out a low, ragged groan as another wave of pressure hit him, his knuckles turning white as he squeezed Toby's hand. "This is entirely inefficient," Arthur panted, sweat dripping down his pale forehead, his blue eyes wide with a rare, visceral fear. "The pain metrics are outside acceptable parameters." Toby leaned down, pressing his forehead against Arthur's, his large hand wiping the sweat from the Omega's brow. His scent gland was working overtime, flooding the sterile hospital room with a heavy, suffocating warmth of sugar and vanilla that acted better than any chemical epidural. "You're doing perfect, Artie," Toby rumbled, his voice fierce with pride and love. "Every contraction is just the oven getting to temperature. You're strong. You built a multi-billion-dollar company, remember? You can handle one little sprout." "I hate you," Arthur gasped as the contraction peaked, his voice cracking. "I hate your bakery. I hate your cinnamon rolls." "I know, sweetheart," Toby smiled, his own eyes tearing up as he kissed Arthur's white knuckles. "I love you too. Just keep breathing. I'm right here. I'm holding the line." For 5 grueling hours, the boardroom baker held the defensive line. He didn't leave Arthur's side for a single second, offering his strength, his scent, and his endless, unshakable patience as the Ice Prince fought the hardest battle of his life. Arthur didn't give up, he weaponized every ounce of his formidable discipline, focusing entirely on Toby's voice through the dark, roaring waves of pain. At 9:42 a.m., with one final, desperate push that tore a raw, crying sob from Arthur's throat, the room was suddenly filled with a sharp, thin, beautiful wail. The physician lifted a small, slippery, beautiful baby girl, her skin pink and healthy, a thick tuft of dark hair already clinging to her scalp. "It's a girl, Arthur," Toby choked out, the massive alpha openly weeping as the nurses quickly wiped the baby down and laid her directly onto Arthur's bare, trembling chest. The moment the baby touched his skin, Arthur's entire body went limp. His scent, which had been sharp and metallic with pain, instantly exploded into a massive, suffocatingly sweet cloud of silver needle tea and pure, golden clover honey. He looked down at the tiny, fragile creature resting against his heart, her little hands twitching against his skin. Arthur lifted a shaking, slender hand, his fingers gently brushing the baby's incredibly soft cheek. A look of such profound, fierce maternal devotion crossed his face that Toby felt his breath leave his lungs. "She looks like you," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling as he looked up at Toby, his blue eyes shining with tears. "She has your jaw, Tobias." Toby leaned down, wrapping his massive arms around both of them, his heart overflowing as he pressed a deep, emotional kiss to Arthur's lips and then to the baby's tiny head. "She's beautiful, Artie. She's completely perfect. Just like her papa." The ice had finally, completely melted, leaving behind nothing but the warm, sweet earth of a real family. The silence of the penthouse during the second month of Arthur's parental leave was not the sterile, empty quiet he had cultivated for a decade. It was a soft, living silence, punctuated by the rhythmic puffing of a baby's breath and the low, comforting hum of the refrigerator. Arthur sat in the center of the massive plush rug in his living room, wearing a pair of charcoal gray cashmere sweatpants and a thick, oversized cream sweater. His hair, usually styled with military precision for the boardroom, was soft and brushed back casually from his forehead. On his chest, wrapped securely in a premium silk and wool sling, slept 2-month-old Chloe. She was a perfect blend of her parents. She possessed Arthur's striking, crystal blue eyes, when they were open, and Toby's thick, unruly curls and relaxed, deeply sweet temperament. She smelled faintly of milk and vanilla. Arthur was staring at his tablet, which was balanced on a velvet cushion in front of him. On the screen, a high-definition video feed showed the main boardroom of Vance Global Holdings. Julian was currently attempting to chair the Q2 operational review, and he was failing miserably. The logistical overhead for the European sector is, experiencing an upward variance, Julian stammered on screen, sweating profusely under his sharp suit. Arthur clicked his microphone on. "The variance is 2.4%, Julian," his voice rang out through the speakers in the distant boardroom, smooth, cool, and instantly commanding. The entire room of executives jumped, their heads snapping toward the monitor. It is not an upward variance. It is a failure to renegotiate the fuel hedging contracts before the April deadline. Fix the model by Friday, or I will replace you with a predictive algorithm. Yes, Mr. Vance. Immediately, Mr. Vance. Julian squeaked. Arthur cut the feed with a swift flick of his thumb, a slight, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He leaned back against a mountain of pillows, his hand coming down to gently cup Chloe's small, warm head through the fabric of the sling. The front door opened, and Toby walked into the penthouse. He was carrying a massive wicker basket covered with a linen cloth, and his entire presence was a walking radiator of heat and safety. He smelled of toasted pecans, dark espresso, and the fierce, unshakable satisfaction of a bonded alpha. He kicked off his boots, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and walked over to the rug. He didn't say a word, he simply sank his massive frame down next to Arthur, pulling the Omega and the baby directly into his broad chest. He leaned down, pressing his lips to the crook of Arthur's neck, his scent gland releasing a thick, soothing wave of burnt sugar that made Arthur's inner Omega purr with an almost embarrassing intensity. "You're terrorizing the board again," Toby murmured, his deep baritone vibrating against Arthur's shoulder. "They are functionally incompetent without direct supervision, Tobias," Arthur replied smoothly, though he let his head drop back onto Toby's chest, his eyes closing as he inhaled his alpha's scent. "They have no grasp of predictive logistics. They're doing just fine, Artie. The stock is stable, and the company hasn't burned down," Toby chuckled, his large, rough hand sliding over Arthur's hip to rest against the small of his back, rubbing away the residual aches of late-night nursing. "Look what I brought you." Toby pulled back the linen cloth on the basket. Inside were fresh, golden-brown brioche buns stuffed with a rich, savory filling of wild mushrooms, goat cheese, and fresh tarragon, alongside a thermos of hot red bush tea. Arthur's mouth watered instantly. His body's reliance on Toby's baking had not diminished after birth, if anything, the demands of nursing had made his cravings even more primal. He took a bun, biting into the flaky, rich pastry, a soft sound of absolute approval escaping his throat. "You are a terrible influence on my discipline," Arthur muttered, his fingers dusted with a fine layer of flour from the pastry. Toby smiled, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss to Arthur's lips, tasting the sweet butter and savory tarragon. "I'm the father of your child, sweetheart. It's my job to make sure you're soft, fed, and completely protected. Get used to it." Arthur looked down at Chloe, who let out a tiny, milky sigh in her sleep, her little hand gripping a strand of Arthur's cashmere sweater. For a man who had once believed that his dynamic was a weakness to be conquered, Arthur realized that this fortress of warmth, flower, and unconditional love, was the greatest empire he would ever build. On a crisp, bright Monday morning in early June, the atmosphere on the 50th floor of Vance Global Holdings reached a fever pitch of anticipation. The 3-month parental leave was officially over. The CEO was returning. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, expensive chime. The entire administrative staff stood at absolute attention, expecting the return of the terrifying, ice-cold machine in the 3-piece charcoal suit. Arthur Vance stepped out of the elevator. He was breathtakingly beautiful, but the frost had permanently cracked. He wore a perfectly tailored navy silk trench coat over a cream silk blouse and dark trousers. His waistline had returned to its elegant, slender proportions, but his skin carried a radiant, healthy glow that no one had ever seen on him before. His scent blockers were dialed down to a comfortable, civilized minimum. He smelled of crisp silver needle tea, underlined by a deep, rich, undeniable sweetness of wild honey and a faint, unmistakable note of his alpha's warm vanilla. But it was what he was carrying that made the receptionists gasp. Strapped securely to his chest in a custom-designed, sleek black leather executive baby carrier was Chloe. She was wide awake, her bright blue eyes blinking curiously at the high-tech surroundings, a tiny silver rattle shaped like a crescent croissant clutched in her small fist. "Good morning, Evelyn," Arthur said, his voice carrying its trademark clarity and absolute authority as he glided past her desk. Please ensure the Q3 macro forecast models are on my desk within 10 minutes. Why yes, Mr. Vance. Welcome back. Evelyn stuttered, her eyes darting to the baby, who let out a happy, high-pitched squeak in response to her name. Arthur walked into his monolithic office, sitting down behind his obsidian desk. He adjusted the baby carrier slightly, allowing Chloe to rest comfortably against his lap as he brought up his financial monitors. Within minutes, he was diving into data streams, his mind as sharp and formidable as ever, but his left hand never stopped its gentle, rhythmic patting of his daughter's back. At 10 a.m., the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open for the first executive meeting of the quarter. The vice presidents filed in, looking cautious, their eyes instantly locking onto the tiny human attached to their terrifying chief executive. Let us begin with the logistics merger, Arthur stated, his blue eyes scanning the table, completely unbothered by the child in his lap. Julian, your report. Before Julian could speak, the double doors at the back of the boardroom opened with an easy, familiar swing. Toby walked in. He wasn't carrying a delivery tray today. He was wearing a sharp, custom-fitted dark green button-down shirt that emphasized his massive shoulders, his hair brushed back, though his forearms still bore the faint trace of flour from the early morning bake. He was here as the official managing partner of the flour and finance corporate wellness sector. In his hands, he carried a small, elegant silver platter with a single, perfectly glazed lemon blueberry scone and a fresh cup of ginger tea. He walked right past the stunned board members, completely ignoring the corporate hierarchy, and stepped up to the head of the table. He set the platter down right next to Arthur's high-tech control panel. Then, completely disregarding the hundreds of billions of dollars of corporate power represented in the room, Toby leaned down. He pressed a firm, deeply possessive kiss to Arthur's lips, and then leaned lower to kiss Chloe's forehead, his large hand coming to rest on Arthur's shoulder, releasing a massive, soothing wave of warm sugar and cinnamon that instantly turned the clinical room into a sanctuary. Don't forget to eat your breakfast, Artie, Toby murmured, his deep baritone carrying a low, affectionate rumble that made Arthur's eyes soften with an incredible, blinding warmth. You've got a long day of conquering the market. Arthur looked up at his alpha, his blue eyes filled with a profound, unshakable devotion that the business world had never thought possible for the Ice King. He reached up, his slender fingers squeezing Toby's large hand on his shoulder. Thank you, Tobias, Arthur whispered softly, his scent expanding into a rich, syrupy wave of honey and tea that perfectly complemented the aroma of the scone. Ensure the first-floor kiosk is fully stocked for the afternoon rush. Always, sweetheart, Toby smiled, giving Arthur's shoulder one final, supportive squeeze before turning to the boardroom. He offered a cheerful, completely unbothered nod to the stunned vice presidents. Have a good meeting, gentlemen. Try not to stress the boss out. As the doors closed behind the boardroom baker, Arthur cleared his throat, his face instantly smoothing back into a mask of perfect corporate authority, though the corner of his mouth remained pulled up in a permanent, soft smile. Now, Julian, Arthur Vance commanded, his hand gently stroking his daughter's curls as his empire ran flawlessly on the power of flour, finance, and family. As I was saying, show me the data.
Thank you for watching, dear darlings. Don't forget to like and subscribe the channel for more such story.